This week, we will be exploring the topic of sexual orientation and gender. Please refer to the 5 articles located in Canvas and also the discussion questions.
Hey.
Hey.
You okay?
I'm good. Here.
Look at you.
Hi, Mom.
Hi, baby.
Mom, this is Amy.
Oh,
It's so
hi,
nice to meet
Amy.
you. Hey, Dad.
Hey, I'm Amy.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Are you hungry?
Yes.
Come on.
Oh, yes, please.
Homemade jam.
Yes.
It's really challenging to be
Oh, my goodness.
Wow, nice to see you.
Totally. Oh
Oh my God.
my God. You just wanted my help, I know.
All over your face.
You're the cutest little enough.
Here you go. Happy birthday.
Hey, Dad.
Hey,
Night.
Night.
good night.
John. Is that your dad?
What is he doing? Dad.
Did I do it right? I love you. You like it?
I love it.
In this video, we'll be going over the following 5 articles: Considering Transgender People in Education, Inclusive Classrooms for LGBTQ, Gay-Straight Alliances in Mental Health, Native American, Lesbian, and Two-Spirited, and Future Directions in Addressing Mental Health Amongst Youth.
As you review the video, we ask that you think about these things. What are the main takeaways from these articles? Are there any motives or conclusions you can draw from these articles? Are the actions or outcomes suggested in the articles reasonable? Are there better or different alternatives? If I could change one thing, it would be that all people were required to understand that there are more than 2 categories of gender. That way, other kids won't have to suffer like I did. Brill and Pepper, 2008.
Let's take a look at our first article, Considering Transgender Students in Education, A Gender Complex Approach, RANDS 2009.
The first reading we were tasked with is called Considering Transgender People in Education, A Gender Complex Approach by Kathleen Rands. This article outlines the necessity for changing the way teachers are educated around gender and transgender issues. As a starting point, Rands suggests the importance of simply understanding the terminology surrounding gender and transgender education. Some important vocabulary she suggests to know and understand are gender identity, gender expression, gender attribution, gender roles, gender assignment, and transgender. According to Rands, the research has primarily focused on gay and lesbian issues, which, although beneficial, has left transgender issues on the back burner. This lack of resources for teacher educators prevents transgender students from understanding and expressing their true feelings, and often leads to transgender or non-normative students to feel that their schools are unsafe. The lack of education around transgender issues is fueling transphobic behavior, such as bullying and in some cases severe violence against transgender students and anyone who may transcend gender norms. Rands feels that the education system has failed transgender students. The photos depicted here present an example of that notion. The young ballet dancer may have a similar experience to that of a transgender student, simply because they do not conform to stereotypical gender norms. Rands suggests the idea of a gender oppression matrix, which suggests two connected forms of gender oppression. First is gender category oppression. This represents the system that views those categorized as men as superior to those categorized as women. Male students are privileged, female students are oppressed. This has traditionally been seen as sexism. Rand states it really has nothing to do with sex, meaning a person's biological and physiological characteristics, and more to do with gender, so the characteristics of men and women that are socially constructed. Next is gender transgression oppression, and this outlines those who fall into the category that cross gender lines or reject gender norms altogether. These students challenge the assumption that gender maps directly on their biology and are therefore oppressed. One example Rands uses here to demonstrate the gender oppression matrix is a female who dresses in conventional female clothing is oppressed based on gender category, because she identifies as a woman, but is also privileged based on gender conformity. She identifies with her gender at birth. Further compounded when race and heteronormativity interact with the gender oppression matrix. Heteronormativity is the thought that only heterosexual relationships are natural and normal, which encourages further privilege, while racism further oppresses. Black trans men are further oppressed based on the color of their skin.
Creating schools where all students feel safe requires education, and this shouldn't happen after the fact. Teacher training around transgender issues must be proactive. Teachers need to challenge the impact of the gender oppression matrix, which will help protect students in the process.
Next, we will outline Rand's proposed framework for gender education. But before that, we will discuss previous and current ideas of gender education and their suitability within the school system. First up, gender stereotyped education. This is where teachers use terminology within the classroom that's consistent with gender attribution. So the way they see the student using statements like "let's go boys and girls" or separating the class into groups based on their gender. This education also assumes interest based on gender, and as such, assignments and class activities can be based on the gender category. So this form of education further promotes the gender oppression matrix. Next is gender-free, gender-blind education. This thought said gender should be ignored in education because it was irrelevant. This made us think back to week 3 when we were discussing racism and the whole notion of "I don't see color." Seems a very similar concept. However, inherent feelings about gender work unconsciously in teachers, and so this then further promotes the gender oppression matrix. Next is gender-sensitive education, and this is where teachers are asked to constantly reflect on how gender is impacting situations and try to come up with strategies and sometimes even policy change to counteract further bias around sex or encourage equality about sex. This model does address gender category oppression, but it leaves gender transgression unchallenged. Thus, it also promotes the gender oppression matrix. So what we need to see, and what Rands is suggesting, is a gender complex approach. So this framework challenges the entire gender oppression matrix, not just parts of it. Teachers will continue to reflect on how gender is operating and what are the consequences as they do in gender-sensitive education, but it considers both sides of the gender oppression matrix. This approach takes into consideration the privileges and oppressions students face based on gender categories, expressions, and attributions others make of them. Educators see gender as fluid and educate students to push back against the gender oppression matrix. In order for the gender complex approach to work, teacher educators must think about their own views of gender. They likely grew up within an education system that employed one of the first three models. So, they need to think about gender in a more complex way, challenging their own thinking. Second, they must work with students to think about gender in more complex ways. They need to be taught explicit concepts around gender, like the definitions mentioned previously, and explore the issues that further compound the gender oppression matrix, so they can have a clear understanding of gender issues. Finally, teacher educators need to support their students by offering opportunities to explore how they can challenge the gender oppression matrix. Rand suggests a role-playing activity as a great way to foster this activity.
This single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story.
Our second article is Inclusive Classrooms for LGBTQ Students.
The overall purpose of this article is to promote the use of integrative texts that address LGBTQ individuals and their experience as a means to promote and teach social justice. This article begins by examining the danger of single stories, suggesting that doing so robs, criticizes, and destroys the value and dignity of marginalized people by limiting their visibility. Unfortunately, as we know, many schools' texts only tell a single story. In this way, education is not neutral. It perpetuates social norms, the status quo, and single stories, such as heteronormativity. In this way, children face the task of understanding and coming to terms with their sexual identity in an environment that denies and devalues that aspect of them. Curriculum presented in this way demonstrates that there is no way for LGBTQ students to present or see themselves. They are silenced and invisible. This is linked to broader issues of privilege, systemic issues in education like poverty and intersectionality. Lansing's Billings 1995 argued that we must focus on collective empowerment with the belief that we are responsible to develop a broad social political consciousness that critiques the cultural norms, values, and institutions that produce and maintain social inequities. Further to that, Mojo 2007 suggested that teachers must not only provide access to mainstream knowledge and practices, but they must also provide opportunities to challenge, question, and reconstruct knowledge, which results in transforming the learner, also our social and political context. Nito and Bodie 2007 argued that social justice must confront and corrupt misconceptions, untruths, and stereotypes that lead to inequality and discrimination based on differences. In the end, they all agree that teachers must acknowledge that all students have value, and the goal of social justice education is that teachers should create classrooms that promote critical thinking and support social change. This is done to build empathy, support, representation, and understanding amongst all students.
Linked text sets offer to teachers a strategy to disrupt the single story through provocative questions that challenge students to think critically about connections between their lives and text, while also constructing deep, nuanced ideas about the human condition. Let us look at an example. In many schools, classic texts are used to examine the theme of struggles, triumphs, and tragedies of love through texts like Romeo and Juliet, The Scarlet Letter, and The Great Gatsby. However, these texts only show heterosexual love, sex, and marriage. But it's time to think beyond that. How about the possibility of a film like Brokeback Mountain including this film addresses overall themes such as what is love or whom can one love, how does love affect one's identity, and what experiences of love do the characters across the text share. Doing so allows us to examine voice, purpose, craft, word choice, and text structure.
It is important that teachers see themselves as agents of social change, and that their attitudes and decisions will determine whether school is a safe place for LGBTQ students.
All young people, regardless of sexual orientation or identity, deserve a safe and supportive environment in which to achieve their full potential. Harvey Milk. Let's take a look at Article 3, Gay-Straight Alliances and Mental Health.
Gay Straight Alliances, or GSAs, aka Queer Straight Alliances, or QSAs, are student-run organizations that unite LGBTQ, 2S+, and allied youth to build community and organize around issues impacting them in their schools and communities. They're intended to provide a safe and supportive environment for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning, or LGBTQ, 2S+ children, teenagers, and youth, as well as their cisgender, heterosexual allies. They are a relatively new phenomenon, having existed for only a little more than the past 30 years. It's interesting to note that the existence of these organizations coincides roughly with changes in public attitude regarding the LGBTQ, 2S+ communities in North America. At the same time, there are still many places in the world where these groups, especially young people in school, do not enjoy the protections that these organizations can offer. What makes GSAs or QSAs both important and necessary is the reality of homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of discrimination and abusive behavior that exists in schools and in the broader community. Although the question was out of scope for the specific study that is the focus of this paper, there is also evidence that these types of behaviors could contribute to a higher incidence of mental health issues, including suicidality, among LGBTQ2S+ youth. Many students feel comfortable using homophobic and transphobic slurs in casual conversation, even, or perhaps especially, when they're not really relevant. These social environments and the associated peer pressure can lead LGBTQ2S+ students to feel even further victimized and isolated. Sometimes, these hurtful words can escalate to violence or threats of violence, making these young people feel unsafe and without options. GSAs or QSAs can help alleviate some of these pressures. They provide a safe space where LGBTQ2S+ students can find comfort with their peers and other like-minded individuals. They can help these students develop leadership opportunities through feelings of belonging and kinship. There is also strong evidence that the mere presence of a GSA can make the school safer and lead to better academic outcomes for everyone. The authors of this article speak directly to this point. In a very large-scale mixed method study in Wisconsin, they asked detailed questions on a range of topics, as you can see here. They found a strong correlation between the presence of GSAs and student health. They also recommend that GSAs alone should not be expected to serve as the sole or even the primary mechanism of change for the issues these students face. Other inclusive measures are also required, such as a protective environment that includes enforcement, an inclusive curriculum, and anti-bullying programs. Even almost 30 years on, GSAs remain somewhat controversial even in countries where they're widely accepted. Just 2 years ago, the government of Alberta brought in measures to restrict these groups' activities, arguing that existing human rights protections were sufficient. GSAs are also facing other existential challenges. In a pandemic era, they can't offer the safe physical space that is so central to their success.
The cultural position of the two-spirited people is not about gender and sexual politics, nor about their sexual preferences. Instead, the two-spirited people hold a symbolic place of honor in their societies. Zavalos, 2013.
Let's dive into Article 4, Native American, Lesbian, and Two-Spirited, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives.
While Two-Spirit has come to be widely used in LGBTQ Indigenous contexts and organizations, it needs to be mentioned that not all LGBTQ Native Americans, First Nations people identify as Two-Spirit. Ever since the beginning of European colonization, Two-Spirit were accepted and sometimes even revered by their respective Indigenous societies. The status and role were met with disdain by the colonizers, to the extent that the Spaniards, the first Europeans, attempted to physically exterminate the proposed sodomites, committing what has been termed genocide on them. Today, the overall impression is that while Indigenous ways are generally cherished, preserved, and in many cases revived in Native American communities, the traditions of gender diversity are quite obviously something most people do not wish to see revitalized. Human beings who are ambiguous in terms of their sexual features or display a discrepancy between their physical sex and their occupational preferences are accepted as part of the natural order of things. In other words, they are not what in Western culture is termed deviant. In some cases, they are even welcomed as people who have been blessed or touched. One person told me, well, those old burdocks, they were nothing but drag queens, weren't they? And I said, no, they weren't, because they didn't dress in women's clothes just because of personal preference. It was because of the manifestation of spirit. They had to do it, you know? They had to act on the vision in order to be a complete person. Michael Owlfeather.
Research has established intractable and persistent disparities in mental health, substance abuse, and other indicators of wellness among lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning LGBTQ youth relative to their heterosexual and cisgender peers. Our last article focuses on the future directions in addressing mental health among the LGBTQ youth. The LGBTQ+ community experiences anti-LGBT stigma and discrimination on a daily basis. This can elevate distress and limit effective coping strategies that can interfere with positive development, health, and their well-being. These stressors can include policies and laws that limit the rights and protections of LGBTQ+ people, interpersonal experiences of rejection or harassment, and lastly, internalized feelings of self-directed stigma such as internalized homophobia and transphobia. 50 years, attitudes towards the LGBTQ community and their relationships have steadily improved. We have witnessed the repeal of harmful policies such as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the enactment of laws that provide protections for LGBTQ people and their families. The visibility of the LGBTQ people in mainstream culture, such as media and politics, has also provided evidence of how much things have changed with regards to LGBTQ people and their communities. Despite the acceptance and increased awareness of the LGBTQ+ community, youth still continue to show elevated rates of mental distress, symptomology, and substance use in comparison to their non-LGBTQ youth peers. Why are the LGBTQ youth facing so many different mental health barriers? LGBTQ individuals are coming out at a younger age, which is coinciding with adolescence. Adolescence is a critical period for the onset and progression of mental health symptomology and substance use behaviors. Another key factor to consider is that adolescents are also required to attend school and are financially dependent on family, which eliminates opportunities to exit unsafe environments. What are some current strategies to support LGBTQ+ youth? The article talks about 3 different strategies. Individual, such as therapy. School policies, such as what we talked about before, gay-straight alliances. And provincial/state policies, equality and protective rights. What is the future direction for mental health to support the LGBTQ+ youth? FISH recommends 6 areas of opportunity for research and support. Framing LGBTQ health disparities in a life course. Expanding notions of mental health. Attending and considering the complexity of a youth's experience and context. Acknowledging heterogeneity. Leveraging community resources. And lastly, fostering team science approaches to inquiry and application. In conclusion, FISH recommends more research to mobilize and promote mental health at a broader scale, to create LGBTQ-specific programs for youth, and also evidence-based prevention and intervention programs at the school level. What can we do to support LGBTQ individuals going forward? Here are some resources that you can take a look at. After watching the video, please answer the following synthesis questions on Canvas. How can we use a social justice lens to disrupt the single story for LGBTQ individuals? How might you demonstrate a gender complex approach and inclusive practices within your school or workplace? And how can we successfully support gay and straight alliances? What current measures do you have in your school and workplace to support the mental health of LGBTQ+ individuals? Can you identify any opportunities? And lastly, what can we learn from the Indigenous view of two-spirited people to our approach to teaching sexuality? For more information, please feel free to look up the articles or check out any of these references.